Good morning and welcome to today's Knowledge Bank entitled Health Check Your Block. This morning's webinar will be hosted by the Ringley Group, and their team of experts are going to be talking you through how to health check your block, including a service charge case law update, health and safety, fire door inspections, and all principal accountable persons, and also some other points. If you have any questions throughout the session, then please submit them via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get through as many as possible. Today's webinar is also being recorded and will be available to watch back later on today. I will also have a copy of the slides which I will be able to share. That is all from me. I'm now going to pass you over to Kate Robinson from the Ringley Group.
Hello everyone. First off, I apologise. I am not technologically advanced, so there's a chance that I'm going to screw something up on the presentation. So I'm going to get to my slides, which are a little bit further down, which I apologise, we're running a little bit strange here. Oh, my slides are not on here. Anthony. Which is not helpful, it's not a good start. Well, I mean, okay, so I'm going to talk about the building set. In fact, to be fair, whilst we're here, Leanna, do you want to talk about your blog bit instead? Because my bit is not here. My bit though. No. Oh, this is not helpful. I'm so sorry, guys. We're going
version if you go to the other version.
I don't know how to get to the other version.
Do you know, let's get the other version.
So sorry. Hold on a minute. I told you, I warned you already ahead of time. The 19.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah, I think this is it. See, all you need is somebody a bit younger than me. See? So let's just see. 25 size, much better. Okay, so I'm going to get to my bit, which is it. So accountable and principal persons. So the very much amended building safety bill has now been finalised and come into law. The Act is super long and super complex and covers a whole heap of issues and introduces new duties for the new management of fire and building safety. One of the key pieces of legislation and guidance being implemented by the government to enhance building safety, including the Fire Safety Act 2021. But importantly, the Building Safety Act 2022 will change the way buildings are designed, constructed and managed, although for the purposes of this presentation, I'm only focusing on the management side and more specifically high-risk buildings. So I assume at this point you've all done 5,000 webinars and been advised by your management teams about all the different high-risk buildings, but they're defined as buildings that are either at least 18 metres in height or have at least 7 stories, and they contain at least 2 residential units, very specific. Such buildings will need to have a designated accountable person. They're going to be responsible for ensuring that fire and structural safety is being properly managed for the whole building. The accountable person is an individual or an organisation that owns or has a legal obligation to repair any common parts of the building. There can be more than one accountable person in some buildings, at which point there must be a principal accountable person who has overall responsibility. Each accountable person will still have responsibility for managing risks within the areas for which they're accountable. But the statutory responsibility to name a building safety manager has now gone, and the accountable person has to be absolutely clear on how they're going to continue their responsibilities throughout the occupation of the building. So the accountable person, just as an FYI, even though we're going to be talking about principal accountable persons more, accountable persons, they could be a freeholder, estate owner, landlord, management company, resident management company, a right to manage company, the common hold association. And when things change, so they must transfer building safety information to any kind of incoming accountable persons if they sell the property or if they all of a sudden become a right to manage or the RMC is transferred over. They need to be advised, the building safety regulator needs to be advised that there is a new accountable person. So that is that. So in terms of principal accountable people, they must, so these are their obligations now. So they must register the building with the building safety regulator. They must manage the building safety, and to do that, they need to put a safety case, which I'm going to go into a little bit later, for the building. They need to operate a complaint system to investigate concerns about the building safety risks or the performance of an accountable person. So if they think their landlord isn't doing a good job, they need to go and tell people, or their freeholder isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing. They need to display required information, documentation clearly within the building. They need to prepare and update a resident engagement strategy so that residents and owners can participate in making building safety decisions. They need to provide a secure information box, like a girder box. They need to make building plans available. They need to do inspections of the fire doors. And so this is not just the communal areas, this is also the flat front doors, which, as I'm sure all of you are dealing with now, is a massive issue, because obviously flat front doors are demised usually, and so how does the accountable person, principal accountable person, manage to manage that? They need to inspect the lifts and the firefighting equipment more often, and they need to maintain the records for the external walls and their materials. They need to identify, it's not here, they need to identify and assess the fire and structural risks in their building. They need to take steps to prevent incidents from happening, which, to be fair, I'm assuming they should be doing anyway. And they need to put measures in place to lessen the severity of any incident, which I really would hope that they are doing. I'm not going to go to that one. Registering your building. So we talked just briefly about the fact that the principal accountable person needs to register their building. So they need to do this by the 30th of September 2023. When you're first registering, it just asks you for a series of information. So you need to know the number of floors at or above ground level. They need to know the height in meters, the number of residential units, the year it was originally built, the address, and you need to pay £251. Once you've done that, the building safety regulator will invite the accountable person, but they will transfer that over to the principal accountable person to put together a building safety case. This is the relevant building safety information. So this is the golden thread. They need to provide processes for and evidence of engaging with residents, the process for and evidence of a complaints procedure, and the process for and evidence of reporting certain incidents. Once they've done that, they will give a building assessment certificate if they are satisfied with that. What I will say is the registration window is 6 months. It started April 2023. The invitations will be sent on a priority basis, and the whole thing is expected to last about 5 years. And then again, every 5 years, we're going to have to start assessing and making sure that everything is still where it needs to be. Just as an FYI, as an additional, accountable people and the principal accountable people cannot delegate their legal obligations down. So they can delegate their work, but they can't delegate their legal obligations. They can employ an individual or an organisation, managing agent, under a contract to carry out their duties on their behalf, and we as managing agents can charge for that purpose. Accountability for making sure those duties are carried out, and the liability for building safety still remains with the accountable people and the principal accountable people. So it's super important that you let your directors know, if you're a managing agent, that this is their responsibility and what they're going to have to do. If the principal accountable person is an organisation, there's someone within that organisation needs to be the point of contact for the building safety regulator. Now, I know a lot of management companies are employing specific teams to do this for them. It doesn't make them the principal accountable person, that's still the organisation, but actually they're the people that the building safety regulator, a bit like when you had to do the EWS ones, it's a bit like that. They're still the person that they're going to be the person that they contact. Residents and owners must not interfere with safety items or act in a way that would cause risk to the building safety. Now, obviously, this seems obvious, and you would assume that people would understand this. But I think that what this does is gives managing agents more power to act in a quicker and faster way to remedy breaches. So now you can really start to deal in a legal fashion with people having barbecues on their balconies, with people leaving buggies and shoes in the corridors. You know, you can just take it away because actually they're not legally allowed to interfere with it with safety items. And also, obviously, if they start pushing in and opening the AOBs so that they can have a cigarette on the balconies or cigarette outside the AOBs, that's definitely not allowed. The Act doesn't apply to buildings that have been enfranchised and effectively now owned by tenants. So just so you know, I don't think a lot of people would know that. So I think that a lot of people probably signed up to find out about how you measure a building, and I'm not going to lie, I'm not going to tell you how to measure your building. I'm not going to give you some magic formula about, you know, using bricks and counting the number of bricks or using a piece of string. Really, you need to get a surveyor to measure your building to make sure that you're absolutely clear on the height. I think more often than not, it's very obvious. You know, if it's 10 stories, you know that it's going to be okay. If it's 11 stories, you know it's going to be okay. It's where you get to that 9 through 12 story bit that you're just not sure. That's when you need to be absolutely sure, and you need to get a surveyor to measure your building. Specifically where you've got these old buildings. So where you've got new builds, really, you know, they're pretty standard 7 stories. But where you've got old buildings and they've been converted, you know, some of these gorgeous flats have got huge high ceilings. So what you would assume is 1 story actually is probably classed as 2 stories in terms of height. Just so you know, the height of the building is measured from the ground floor to the top floor surface. So the ground floor, you exclude all basements, is that it's defined as the level of the surface of the ground immediately adjacent to the building, or where the level of the surface on the ground on the building is situated is not uniform, the level of the lowest part of the ground immediately adjacent to it. I mean, honestly. So the government have very helpfully given us a little bit of a diagram, which is just here. So you can see this is the ground floor. It's not sub-basement. If you've got a basement flats or you've got machinery in the basement, that's not where it is. It's a ground floor, and it's to the surface, the floor surface of the top floor, not the top of the building, and it doesn't include plant or machinery. It also, yeah, so that's me. The height of the building, in terms of measurement, this is where you're going to get confused. This is where you're going to trip up. So it's like I said before, you need to get a surveyor to measure your building, because actually if you're 1 story out, you're going to fall foul, and then legal action is going to be taken against you. And as your managing agents, you will be expected to be managing this on behalf of your client. So thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry for all of the technical issues. I'm going to pass on to my colleague, Liana, who is going to talk to you about PPM.
Hi guys, so I'm responsible for health and safety and ISO 45001 here at the Ringley Group. So what we're going to go through today is asset register, PPM, British standards, and what ISO 45001 actually is. So to know how to keep your building safe, you need to know exactly what plant is within your building. So if you've got a new building, you've got a nice O&M which describes everything, you should have an asset register in it. If not, you do need to have a walk around and see what plant is in it. You need to know the description, where it is, how you access it, who the installer is, if there's any guarantees or not, because the minute you mess with it, you are liable to pay everything. So it's very important that you know that. You need to know the installation year so you can organise a CapEx, so you know when it is due to fail and how much you need to put aside to pay for it, make, model, and the serial number. So all of that will lead to your PPM. So what a PPM is we legally have to service these plant items a certain amount of times a year, which is outlined by the British standards. So for instance, lifts have to be checked every 6 months. Emergency lighting, you need to do a monthly flick test and an annual test. So the British standards outlines each of these plant items and how often. So you need to know what's in your building from your asset register to know how to maintain it. And then what it does is you have to have all your certification, and you have to work through any recommendations that they go through. So the PPM gives you a visual look at when it's due, when it's next due, so you can always organise your certification. So what this all leads to is ISO 45001. So this is the world standard for health and safety in residential buildings. So the goal is to reduce injuries, diseases, and promoting physical health. So it's from everything from protecting your plants so they're not failing, to protecting contractors when they're on site. So you need to have risk assessments for everything contractors do if it's high risk. So if they're working with hot things in confined spaces, working at heights, if they're working with electricity, fire, or breaking ground. So they need to do a risk assessment, fully look at anything that can go wrong, and then they need a permit to work. You need to have accident and incident reporting, so you know what accidents are occurring, how you're minimizing them for future. And then you have to do a contractor risk assessment. So you know if the contractor has the correct accreditations to do what you are asking them to do. And I think that's actually it for me for health and safety. So I think I'm going to pass you on to my colleague Lee, who is in our in-house solicitor.
Good morning. My name is Lee. I'm a solicitor and partner of Ringley Law. We specialise in leasehold enfranchisement, lease extensions, right to manage, service charge disputes, etc. So I'm going to talk to you about what leasehold reform and what we think may happen in the not distant future. It's a question I'm asked on a regular basis. The government said they're going to make it cheaper and easier to extend leases on private freehold. When's it going to happen? Just before I go into what I think is going to happen, I just want to give a little bit of background. So we're talking about the Leasehold Reform, Urban Development and Housing Act 1993 and the Commonwealth Leasehold Reform Act 2002. So two pieces of legislation that have been in place now for 30 years and 21 years respectively. Both pieces of legislation dramatically changed the rights of leaseholders, gave them more powers to take control, to buy the freehold, whatever it may be. I think it became quickly apparent that there are certain shortfalls, deficiencies, or drawbacks with this legislation, which freeholders can sometimes use to frustrate, block, or delay, or even prevent leaseholders taking what action they want to take. So I think it's been clear for some time that reforms been needed. The Law Commission undertook over a full consultation process, published 3 papers in 2020, listing their recommendations about how to change, how to improve it for leaseholders to make it fairer, more transparent, quicker, easier. But we're now 13 years into a Tory government. We've had 15 housing ministers in that time, 6 housing ministers in the year. Realistically, we're within 18 months of another general election. So I have my reservations about how much they can get through before said general election. You have to consider that since 1993 and the 2002 Acts, the main piece of legislation in this field is the Ground Rent Reforms Act, which came into force last July, which meant that ground rent can no longer be charged on new leases. So that's taken quite a long time to go through in itself. And when you look at this piece of legislation, it has to be consulted upon, has to be drafted, go before the House, etc. So I think we're pushing it quite tight. Michael Gove, a somewhat advisory figure amongst leasehold practitioners, has made some comments this year. Early start of the year, he talked about abolishing leasehold and bringing it through common hold, which didn't really seem realistic at the time. When you look at common hold, it's been in place for more than 20 years, and it's almost 1 block per year. It works out maybe 2 blocks per year. It hasn't taken on at all, and there are certain drawbacks with common hold ownership structure, which I think has been recognised. It has been consulted on, but the government has last month stepped back and said they're not going to abolish leasehold because I think they realised it was too complicated and too much of a minefield to get over the line in the next 18 months or so. So in terms of what I think they will do, I'm going to run through some of the law. So I'm going to run through what the law is now and what the Law Commission has proposed and what I think may happen. So starting with lease extensions. So under the current process, you can apply for a statutory lease extension under Section 42 of the 93 Act. Under that process, you're applying for another 90 years at a peppercorn ground rent, or 50 years for a house. and you can make fairly limited changes to the lease. You also have non-statutory lease extensions where you can agree a deal outside of the act. That sometimes previously they'll be keeping a ground rent, which is no longer the case, obviously, but you need to arrange lender consent, and the lease may not be as long. Or for the lease extension where you bought the freehold and you give yourself an 199-year lease extension. Now, in terms of lease extensions, I think there's some fairly obvious and easy changes they can make. It's never really made sense to me why you have to own the property for 2 years, for instance, to qualify for statutory lease extension. I'm sure there was a reason at the time. I'm not aware of what it is, but it does sound ridiculous that you have to go through a process of you either wait for 2 years or you have to get the seller to serve a notice on your behalf when you're buying and then taking over the process. That to me seems nonsensical. There's talk also about the Commission has proposed extended changing from 90 years to 990 years. Obviously, that would be quite a drastic change, and will stop the process for the moment where you extend now and you have to extend again another 20 years or so. They're talking about making other changes to the leases to modernise, especially older leases, so maybe a little out of date. May not cater for reserve funds, for instance. May not talk about things the managing agents need in the modern day. And we're talking about the possibility of buying out ground rent, whereby you buy out the ground rent of the existing lease without extending the lease. Of course, it makes it a more attractive proposition to a purchaser. So of the changes, I think they probably will limit ground rent somehow again. You every now and then you come across a ridiculous ground rent provision which doubles every 10 years, which I never really understand why they're executed, I suppose, but people aren't looking back long down the line, I suppose, when they're buying a leasehold flat, that's perhaps their first property. I think it's the first step in the ladder, and we're not going to be there for when those larger larger ground rent provisions kick in. But you do see some ridiculous ones every now and then, and you think at some stage they're going to have to cap those or limit them somehow. I wouldn't be surprised if they moved the 2-year ownership requirement as well. That seems a fairly non-controversial one. But again, it's all about timing and whether or not they can get it through. Apparently there are going to be some changes announced in the next month to 6 weeks or so. So I imagine maybe that the capping the ground rent somehow, and maybe removing a 2-year requirement will be one. Moving on to right to manage. Now, those of you familiar with the right to manage process, this will be very familiar to you. Obviously, you're looking at what's the qualifying building. Is it a self-contained building? At the moment, you're required for less than 25% of that building can be commercial, used for commercial purposes to qualify. You can only have 1 RTM per building, only 1 RTM per property. Sham RTMs can block a genuine RTM. And there's also limited rights to information for landlords. I think one of the major kind of barriers to the right to manage process is that so you may not know who your fellow leaseholders are, and the requesting the information from the landlord or the management company, or managing agents, I should say, can be a laborious process, and it's not really clear. Do you have to form the company beforehand to be able to claim for information? The amount of time it takes to provide the information does drag the process out. So I think right to manage, it's a process that mostly works pretty well, but I think there are some drawbacks. So there's some of the Law Commission proposals it doesn't have to be a self-contained building, which deal perhaps with when you've got buildings that overreach basements or have car parking issues. They're talking about increasing the commercial element to 50%, which again, I think that kind of makes sense. Whenever I do one of these with a commercial element, you always need to reread the rules a few times to understand how you do the measurements. And it's quite a complicated process. So I think it does make sense to increase it to 50%. We talk about multi-building RTM companies, especially on larger estates. Why do you really need to have 1 RTM per building? And then when what happens with the common areas? Talking about preventing sham RTMs and making it easier to get information from landlords. I always think that's a fairly they'll make the system a lot easier. What I think they will do in the next, again, I think they'll probably change to commercial element, and hopefully they may make it easier to get the information. A problem I've always had with the RTM as well is that you're not required to join the RTM, and that it always is, once you've achieved it, people can step back and reap the benefits without paying the costs. And then you have the dwindling membership, which then drops down, and especially when you're a buyer of a property that has an RTM, you're not obliged to become a member of the RTM. I always think that it would make the system a lot easier if there was some kind of requirement to force you to join, so it keeps the numbers up and avoids the problem that if you drop between 50%, the landlord can theoretically take the membership back from the right to manage company. So I always think that's a kind of an easy solve. Whether or not that's going to take place or not is the question. And very finally, talking about franchising very quickly, you're looking at more than half the qualifying tenants need to, on the existing process, and more than half the existing qualifying tenants need to take part. There needs to be a single, separate, self-contained building, and again, less than 25% commercial area. So there's always some overlaps with the RTM kind of process. So they're suggesting that it's a requirement to form a new company. Now you'll know that you can form, do fair purchase in a smaller block, converted house in 3 or 4 flats, and do it as individuals' names. But the problem that is that you would need to get 3 or 4 names to sign the paperwork. Now you can only have, I think it's 4 individual names on the leasehold title. But it can become complicated if people are based abroad, or if relationships break down. The execution documents can become more difficult. Obviously, the drawback of having 3 companies is obviously the running costs, filing the annual accounts, filing confirmation statements. But I think I will nearly always advise clients to form a company when they're looking at fees. But obviously, this only applies to smaller, because if you have 5 or more, you'll need to form a company. So I think forming companies makes sense to me. Talking about, does it not have to be a self-contained building? You have multiple flow company. Again, it's talking about like larger estates, not having to do it block by block. Increasing the commercial element again to 50% is kind of, I never really understood why it has to be up to 25%. And putting in place a 2-year ban on enfranchisement, which is an interesting one. When you have the warring factions, it is possible for one group to buy the freehold, and then theoretically another group can buy off them a few months afterwards. I've actually seen that in practice. I know it's possible. They're talking about putting a 2-year ban in place, and I think that's a really good opportunity. They're talking about giving a right to participate. Where you have a right to participate in the right to manage process, you have to be formally invited. When you buy the freehold, some leaseholders may not be able to afford it, and then they'd have to wait and ask to join later. Now, it can be a closed shop, but we're talking about introducing a right to have the guaranteed right to be able to join later, which obviously means the costs will be split more ways, getting more people inside the tent from everyone outside. That makes sense to me. But as I say, as I started off with, we've got a government that's perhaps with more burning higher things up on their list in terms of base rates, mortgage increases, the fallout from Brexit, etc. But I'd be surprised if significant changes are made in this field in the next 18 months. But I suspect that minor changes to ground rents, capping ground rents, making it easier to get right to manage, I think it will come through. And they're also perhaps talking about limiting the recoverability of costs when you go to leaseholder costs when you go into tribunal, and capping them again somehow, because the tribunal can be used by unscrupulous freeholders to drag out the costs, drag out processes, and then people can't fall away because they can't afford to keep going. So I think perhaps they could limit those somehow. how it's going to work in practice, I'm not entirely sure, but I'm looking forward to seeing it in the not too distant future. And that's me. I think I'm around for questions at the end, but now I'm going to be my colleague John is joining, is taking over.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Lee. If we could move to the next slide. Anthony, please. Oh, there we go. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to cover, rather than cover the legislation that's changed in great detail, we're just going to focus a bit more on what we need to do and a solution that we've come up with in order to deal with that. There are others on the market, but obviously Ringley have been at the forefront of this for some time. So moving on, want to hit a fairly hard statistic. Could next slide, please, Anthony. Last week, it's a bit of a shocking statistic, actually, when you think about it. Last week saw the 6th anniversary of the Grenfell tragedy. 72 months since the loss of 72 lives. And in this time, we've seen legislation, probably the biggest in 4 decades, impact the building industry and property industry. So we had the Building Safety Act 2022, and at last the implementation of the Fire Safety Act, brackets England, close brackets, regulations 2022. This is catching up on where Wales were about 8 months ago. But as of January 2023, these moves have finally allowed focus on internal compartmentation and means of escape, as well as the external cladding, with the emphasis on occupant safety. We've striven at Ringley to try and bring this home to all the powers that be, that it's not just about protecting the building and about the cladding. There are issues internally that are quite significant. So the latter legislation and regulations make significant changes to the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005, known as the Order, requiring responsible people, and people have been identified as having additional responsibilities under these acts, to inform occupants what to do in the case of fire, register details above 18 metres high with the building safety regulator, and carry out mandatory fire door inspections, or FDIs, as I will probably refer to them here on in. So moving on to where we stand now. Someone please change the slide, as I am remote. Mandatory fire door inspections. It is a legal requirement now. And how do you measure a building in terms of what you need to do and how that implies or impacts on the fire door inspections you need? They're measured from ground floor level adjacent to the building to the finished floor level of the uppermost residential unit. The extent of fire door inspection varies dependent upon this height. This measurement of height has been fairly consistent throughout the whole process since Grenfell, with the 18-metre rules always being to that which a fire brigade ladder, a standard fire brigade ladder at the time, could reach. So buildings above 11 metres high, measured on this basis, they require communal and riser doors to be inspected quarterly, 4 times per annum. Plus, the resident flat entrance doors need to be inspected annually on a best endeavours basis. That best endeavours means that the responsible person can demonstrate that they've made every effort, whether that be knocking on the doors, sending advance information about what the doors are about and when we intend to inspect them, or some other form of the residents being able to book an appointment with a suitable inspector. In buildings below 11 metres in high on that basis, communal and riser doors need to be inspected every 6 months, only twice a year, and the resident flat entrance doors do not have to be inspected as a mandatory requirement at this stage. Although we have a number of clients, a number of sites that have actually said, for peace of mind, they want their flat entrances where they open onto a common parts undertaken. And so obviously one can only oblige. So the background to this, fire safety in a block of flats clearly is about compartmentation of the whole building. That means its ability to contain fire and smoke until it is extinguished. So you break the building down into compartments, and those compartments are often formed by fire resistant construction and or fire doors. And this aims to protect the normal escape route through those common areas, allowing residents to evacuate safely. Now, usually the largest opening you form in any compartmentation structure is actually a door. So those fire doors need, and their assembly, a door set, needs to be designed and tested to resist that spread of fire and smoke. Now, even though they may have been fully compliant at day one when it was installed, over time, issues can arise through wear and tear, damage, vandalism, alterations or replacement. Therefore, it's essential that these doors are inspected regularly to ensure that any failures are highlighted and suitably addressed. These doors, so that these doors can perform at their best on the one and only occasion when they're actually really called upon to do so. So next up. What's our solution? Other people have tried this, but I think what Ringley have done, because we've been at the forefront of this, is try and find a holistic solution. So to cope with this sea change in legislation, Ringley have developed an inspection app, which allows our qualified inspectors to carry out detailed fire door inspections at scale. And that's the issue. There are so many doors that need to be inspected in this country. Using our app, we're able to issue a report of our findings of the inspection, and an inspection certificate giving a pass or a fail for each door, as well as a summary for each block. We've now even expanded the FDI capacity to enable us, at request, to generate direct from our inspections a schedule of rates for necessary repairs or replacements to ensure compliance, ready for tendering. So what's involved in a fire door inspection? For a communal door with some glass in it, there's actually 58 physical checks that the inspector undertakes, 47 checks for riser cupboards, and 40 checks for a residential flat entrance door, assuming it hasn't got any glass in it. We're checking the closers, we're checking the hinges, we're checking the condition of the frame, we're condition of the door. Is the door certified? These make up the checks. And with our app being intuitive, it's easy to embed photographs of the defects we find and follow a structured format in order to carry out a suitable inspection. When we started working with fire doors, we saw a government statistic touted that 1 in 5 doors could have faults. Our experience shows something rather less satisfactory. 3 in 5 of the doors we have inspected at various times in the last couple of years show something like 3 in 5 have some form of defect. Now, whether that be a failed closer, a loose frame, a completely defective door, an uncertified door. And the issue we find that it needs addressing, first of all, is at the booking stage. Booking and QR coding. We had QR codes to communal doors. It allows us to run a history on that door going forward. Contractors can also see which door we're referring to when we say it needs to be repaired, as does the client. You can import your doors into our system, and then you can start the inspections as you go. Smaller sites, we have now developed a way we can add a QR code as we go and create a questionnaire and format for that particular door on the fly, as it were. Residential front doors, the major issue we found, and I'm sure most inspectors find, is access. If you have an apartment block where you have keys and a concierge, with advance warning, that works wonderfully well. But in the real world, in most cases, you need to have some form of booking system. We have provided both. Could we move on to the next slide, please? we have provided both solutions. So we have an app or a web-based resident booking tool to get their doors inspected. So we have two ways of doing this now. We can either provide for a very large site a personalized app for that site, and their residents can go on there. We create booking dates, and they can book their own appointments within certain slots. Alternatively, we can have a web-based that is for general. They are sent a code, they enter a gateway and book their appointment again on predetermined slots. And on smaller sites and on some of the larger sites, this was worked reasonably well. We're asked by the client to do so. We actually predetermine those appointments, give more advance notice. Our inspectors will be here at this time to inspect your door. Please be available. We can now create this bill of quantities. Depending on the size of your site, you may want the reports converted and collated into a bill that is then ready for tendering. So, for example, we have the standard sort of title page and preliminaries, and then we list all the faults and quantities of those faults to that site or to that block. So, for example, hinge replacement required on 52 doors, missing screws required on 16 doors. As a sub, and then a QR code and door location for each fault. It actually lists all the faults, all the required actions, and the locations of those faults in terms of the door numbers and door identification. That document can be sent out to tender, and we've done this with a few sites already. We're getting some good feedback, and because you're hitting a large range of works at once as a document, you're getting economy of scale from contractors rather than phoning up and saying, apparently I need 6 doors replaced, without worrying about the 52 hinges that have an issue. Bearing in mind, every defect of that nature does impact the performance of the door in the case of fire. Following on from our certification, there are 3 types of fail certificates that you can get. You can be passed, and you're told that it's passed and it should be inspected next year, sort of the MOT moment, you know, it'll be fine for another year, perhaps. But there are 3 designations of failure. We have fail, replace the door, fail, replace the door set, far more significant, rarer actually than I first anticipated, and fail, remedial works required. Those remedial works could be reinstalling sufficient intumescent strips. It could be additional screws. It could be, and most commonly, adjustments to the door to make the gaps correct and compliant. Following on from that, when we issue our certificates, we also, obviously for the fails, we issue advice notes on what needs to be done next. So what form of repair, what type of contractor you must use, and we guide them with the list of the appropriate associations to get their contractors from. And then we can follow up with, for minor repairs, invoices from a suitably qualified contractor, possibly reports saying that the thing has now been adjusted. We can make a judgment on that for the time being until that door is next due to be inspected. For communal areas particularly, we almost certainly can validate or endorse the remedial works undertaken by the next quarterly or 6-monthly inspection of the door. So in simple terms, there is a lot of work to be done to make yourself compliant. Our systems that we have in place, I think, make that compliance journey much easier. So as you can see, using our team of inspectors alongside our Ringley fire door inspection app, we can manage every part of your necessary compliance journey. Even with advice notes and following on, if required, we can charge for no-shows if people haven't bothered. And believe it or not, in this day and age, despite the information that it's about and the more knowledgeable we are about the dangers of fire, we still get people not wanting to open their doors to us, or refusing to book doors, or having booked doors not being present. So as a result of which, we've now created a sideline where on sites that we manage with the director's approval, we issue no-show invoices. They are warned of this in advance of booking, and they will get a no-show invoice for the cost of that door at that scale rate. If they no-show again, it increases as we have less doors to cover. So ultimately, you could be charged a fair bit, and then we can try enforcement through our Ringley law colleagues to ensure that the works get undertaken. So a Section 38 repairs notice, and failing all of that, lodge a tribunal action for breach of lease, or seek a court order for specific performance. We can take you from inception to invitation for door inspections, to the inspection, to the report and certification, through advice of what needs to be done next, and if needs be, the legal route to enforcement to get those repairs undertaken. As one client once said to us, why should 2 or 3 people who refuse to access for inspection impact the lives of the remaining people in the block? Which is very true. So, as I say, we can manage every part of your necessary compliance journey, and it is a compliance journey, from booking to managing necessary remedial works arising from those inspections. If I'm not very much mistaken, I believe that's the end of my presentation. And handing over to my colleague Kate.
So I think that actually, even though we did it all a little bit backwards, so it's not me, everyone's already heard from me, but I think that Vicky is now going to ask, inform us of the questions and questions, not answers.
Yeah,
Give me the
I
answers if you want,
will.
that'd be great.
I'll just run through them now. Okay, let's see. So we've got a question from Kevin rather. We manage a block of flats less than 11 meters in height. Having advised that the RMC that a fire door inspection is advisable, perhaps not mandatory under the new Act, they are insisting that we as managing agents do not go to the expense of having the flat doors inspected. Are we correct under the ARMA good management practice, insisting that we go ahead with the inspection?
It's a really tricky one, because obviously any kind of compliance is always a good idea, but actually you can't force it, especially if the flat doors are demised. And so the first thing you need to do is check the lease and make sure that you're clear on whose responsibility, repairing responsibility it is for the flat front doors. After that time, you can then go back and say, you know, good estate management would dictate that we double check the flat front doors, especially if you're on the cusp of 11 meters, you're sort of 10, 9 meters, but then you obviously have the other problem in, if there is a problem, who then pays for it, because you've then found it. It's not a service chargeable item because it's not mandatory. So I think that it just depends on what the lease says, and depends on how fire conscious people are. I think that people really need to understand the difference between cost of living crisis and saving lives. You know, we get that service charges have gone up massively, probably through no fault of our own. You know, energy especially has gone up massively, and so the budgets will be affected, but you know, saving lives can't, you know, what is there to say about that? That's got to be a priority. If you've got a get out policy, if you've got compartmentation issues, if you've got cladding issues, then absolutely they need to be checked, but if you don't, then I think that it's their responsibility, and as long as you've got something in writing from them saying that they don't want it, you've done what you can do.
Okay, hope that
Totally
answers your
agree.
question, Kevin. Okay, we've got a question from Amy. You say that the Act does not apply to enfranchised buildings. Can you clarify what does not apply to them? Is this in relation to registering buildings on other things too?
Yeah, I think I rushed through it so quickly that I didn't actually really expand on it, and I'm sorry about that. Enfranchised buildings aren't included in the financials in terms of the landlords and the landlord certificate, and in terms of repairing obligations. So you still have to register it, you still have to make sure that you're building a building safety case, but in terms of recovering costs, you've got nowhere to recover costs from because you've enfranchised. It was more cost based rather than anything else.
Okay, hope that helps, Amy. Okay, there's a question. If you have front doors opening onto an open balcony walkway, do they need to be inspected? I have a block where the balcony walkway is the only exit.
If that walkway is the means of escape for a block of flats with at least 2 residential units in it, even though it is open, it is the means of escape. Ergo, I would suggest that those doors be inspected. Will have to be inspected
Okay,
if above
thank you, John.
11 metres.
Yes, above 11 metres of earth.
Just to add that in.
Yeah.
Okay, there's another question. What level of PI insurance is required for buildings higher than 18 metres?
There hasn't been any specific stipulations on this, and I think that it's going to be dependent on court cases, funnily enough. It's where the building safety regulator intervenes and then demands things happen after your building safety case has been put forward. And I think that there's nothing stipulating anything right now in terms of management, in terms of construction. Now people are going to be talking about taking additional to cover themselves in the event of claims. But there's nothing specific at the moment, and I think that we're going to have to wait for the first court cases, the first FTT cases to come through before they stipulate anything. So there's no specific. I suppose it's as much as you are prepared to spend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we've got a question from Fraser. Does the Building Safety Act not apply for buildings which own the freehold 18 metres plus? I thought the leaseholder protection wouldn't apply for enfranchised buildings, but would still fall within the high-risk building and would need to be registered even if they own the freehold.
Yeah, so this came into my very off-the-cuff comment of enfranchised buildings aren't included. I probably should have gone into more. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
No, it's still included. It's just the only thing that aren't relevant is the financial repercussions.
Okay, thank you. Someone has asked for the fire door inspection app that I think you mentioned. If you could add the link to the chat as they can't find it.
If you look up on either the App Store or on Google Play or whatever it's called, you're looking for the Ringley Site Inspection app.
Okay, they haven't left their name, but if you can't find it, you can drop me an email and I'll be able to put you in touch with John to download that. Okay, there's another question. Who has to serve the landlord certificate and request leaseholder certificates? The building owner or the management company, which is written into the lease and collects the service charge?
So it's the landlord. The landlord company has to provide the landlord certificate, and the leaseholder certificate is on request.
Okay. One last question. Who is responsible to track back to developers or architects, the building owner or the management company, which is a similar question?
This is a really complicated one, and actually I'm dealing with one at the moment. I think fundamentally who's responsible and who's going to do it are maybe 2 different things. I think it is the resident management company that's written into the lease because the obligations are going to be on them to maintain. It's always about who's maintaining is then who's responsible to rectify in terms of getting things rectified. You know, once you've done that, once you've done your obligations, once you've got legal advice, once you've tracked it back, you can then go back to the landlord freeholder and say, right, this is what we found, you know, we want some compensation. But fundamentally, it's going to be the resident management company that has to do the grunt work in the first instance.
Thank you. Well, there's just a couple more. We've got a few more minutes. We'll do one more. Is there a timescale on upgrading or repairing doors should they fail in inspection?
As soon as possible.
Yes, it's as soon as possible. I mean, the issue often arises with fire risk assessments and with fire door inspections. It depending on the frequency of the fire door inspection, you know, in reality, are you going to have all the doors repaired by the time you have in a building that's above 11 metres, by the time you have your second quarter inspection? In reality, in the real world, probably not. But you have to do the inspections. That is also mandatory. You are required to attend to those defects as soon as possible, as soon as practicable. So one has to make the if you've got finances available for job X and you have an issue with fire safety, you have to probably prioritise fire safety.
Okay, thank you.
Not probably, definitely have to prioritise fire safety.
Yes.
I think especially if your building is a stay put policy, the fact that your fire doors are your primary keep safe and it's not rectified, you're going to be held, or whoever is responsible is going to be held responsible for any loss of life or damage.
True, and if you put that in context, remember Grenfell was they were advised to stay put. What had happened in that building by way of refurbishment had impacted the usefulness of those fire doors and means of escape. So there is the underlying factor. Yes, it must be prioritised, priority one, and absolutely as soon as possible.
Yeah, sure. Okay, thank you guys. Well, yeah, all that's left now is just to say thanks for joining us. Thanks to all of our experts today for answering all the questions in your presentations. I'll have a copy of the slides available if anyone would like them. And as I mentioned earlier, the recording will be available on our YouTube later today. And we have a few more webinars coming up. Yeah, we've got a few more webinars coming up throughout July. So if you have a look on the News on the Block website.
Hi guys, sorry, just one last thing. I'm Anthony James, by the way, I deal with commercial aspects for Ringley. Thank you very much. We've had 180 registrations, so that's a really good turnout. So thank you very much to News on the Block and our sponsors, Towergate, who use wall-to-wall, I believe, and they give a very good service. 001 Utility Brokers just saved our clients over £100,000, one of them, and Clean Heat are a FM company which we use a lot. So thank you very much for our sponsors. Yeah, anyone want any more information about the app or anything on the slides, my email's down there, just give us a call or an email. Thank you very much. Thanks, Vicky.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
Thanks, bye.
Bye.